good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift into the long, quiet story of wine, not as something to pour or pair or impress anyone with, but as one of the oldest companions human beings have ever cultivated. A drink that has traveled alongside us through harvests and empires, through monasteries and merchant ships, through firelight and candle, and now the soft glow of a bedside lamp. If you enjoy these slow journeys, you can follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might like to fall asleep while learning something new. And now, with the night settling around us, let us begin gently. Wine begins, in the simplest telling, with a grape and a little patience, a piece of fruit, a wild yeast resting on its skin, a forgotten vessel in a cool corner of the world. Given time, the sugar inside the grape becomes something else, and the first wines of human history begin to appear. The chemistry is small and ordinary. Yeast consumes sugar and releases alcohol and carbon dioxide. The same reaction happens in fallen fruit on forest floors and in the warm hollow of a broken vine. Long before there were vintners, there were almost certainly accidents. A clay pot of crushed grapes left a little too long, a taste, a pause, a curiosity, and then, slowly, an intention. What makes wine remarkable is not the chemistry alone, but what people did with it once they noticed. They began to choose to save certain seeds, to plant certain hillsides, to ferment in vessels they understood. Wine became one of the first agricultural arts, woven into harvest, ritual, trade, and memory. By the time written history arrives, wine is already old. It appears in the tombs of pharaohs and the songs of poets, poured in temples and traded in amphorae across the Mediterranean. Civilizations rise and fall around it, yet the vine continues, returning each spring, asking only for sunlight and patience and a slope to grow upon. Tonight, we will follow that long thread. We will visit the hillsides where wine first emerged, watch it spread along trade routes and into monasteries, and see how it crossed oceans into new continents. We will walk gently through how wine is made, why certain places produce certain flavors, and what people mean when they speak of terroir, of tannin, of body, and finish. None of it requires study tonight. None of it asks anything of you except to listen. Because at its heart, wine is not really about expertise. It is about time. The time a vine takes to root, a grape to ripen, a fermentation to finish, a wine to age, a region to learn its own soil. And before any of that could begin, before the great regions of France or Italy or Spain had even imagined themselves, the very first vines had to be found, tended, and trusted by people whose names we will never know. The oldest evidence of winemaking yet discovered comes not from France or Italy, but from a small country tucked between the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. In what is now the Republic of Georgia, archaeologists have found clay vessels bearing chemical traces of wine that are roughly 8,000 years old. Long before written language, before pharaohs or philosophers, People in this corner of the world were already pressing grapes and watching them transform. The vessels are called kvevri, large egg-shaped jars of fired clay, often as tall as a person. They were buried up to their necks in the cool earth, which kept the temperature steady through the seasons. Inside those buried jars, crushed grapes fermented quietly, sometimes for months, watched over by families who had inherited the practice from generations long since gone. The same method is still practiced in Georgian villages today, in regions like Kakheti, where families continue to harvest, crush, and bury kuvevri much as their ancestors did. The grapevine itself, the one we still rely on for nearly all fine wine, almost certainly originated near this region. Botanists call it Vitis vinifera. Genetic studies trace its domestication to a broad arc of land stretching from the southern Caucasus through eastern Turkey and northern Iran. It is easy to imagine how it happened. Wild grapes grew in clusters along forest edges, dropping into hollows where rain collected. The skins broke. The yeast, already living on those skins, met the sugar inside. And by the time anyone came back to look, the puddle had changed. From the Caucasus, the practice slowly spread. Archaeological sites in ancient Mesopotamia and the Zagros Mountains show signs of early winemaking. Stone tablets from the Sumerians mention wine as a luxury, reserved for the wealthy and the priests. Beer was the common drink of the people, but wine carried something rarer, a sense of occasion and offering. In ancient Egypt, wine took on still greater meaning. Pharaohs were buried with sealed jars of it, carefully labeled with the year, the vineyard, and the winemaker. These were among the earliest wine labels in history, written in hieroglyphs on the shoulder of each amphora. Some bore the equivalent of vintage statements, indicating that even 4,000 years ago, people understood that some years were better than others. The wine itself would have tasted nothing like what we know today. It was often sweetened with honey, flavored with herbs and resins, sometimes strained through cloth. But the underlying impulse was familiar, the same as ours, to take the fruit of a difficult season and turn it into something that could last. And so the practice traveled outward, carried in jars and on ships, moving toward the warm hills where it would meet a civilization that would shape it forever. When wine arrived in the Greek world, it found a civilization ready to give it language. The Greeks did not invent wine, but they wove it into philosophy, theater, religion, and daily life so deeply that the vine became inseparable from how they imagined the good life. They drank wine at gatherings called symposia, where it was poured carefully, mixed with water, and served as conversation moved between politics, poetry, and the nature of love. The god Dionysus, who presided over wine, was not merely a deity of drunkenness. He represented transformation itself, the strange power of a liquid that could change mood, dissolve formality, and bring strangers into something like friendship. Greek colonists carried the vine across the Mediterranean. They planted it in southern Italy, in Sicily, in what is now southern France, in coastal Spain, and along the shores of the Black Sea. Wherever they founded a city, they planted vineyards alongside olive groves and wheat fields. But the civilization that would shape European wine most decisively was Rome. The Romans inherited Greek viticulture and then expanded it on a scale the world had not seen. As the empire grew, so did its appetite for wine. By the height of Roman power, vineyards stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Rhine, from North Africa to Britain. Roman writers produced detailed manuals on viticulture. Authors like Columella and Pliny the Elder wrote pages on soil, pruning, vessel choice, and the timing of harvest. Much of what they observed remains valid today. The Romans were also the first to systematically classify wine by region. They recognized that wine from certain hillsides tasted reliably different from wine grown elsewhere, even when the same grape was planted. A wine called Falernian, produced on slopes north of Naples, became legendary across the empire, sometimes aged for decades and reserved for the wealthiest tables. What Rome contributed, perhaps more than any other civilization, was infrastructure. Roman roads carried wine in heavy clay amphorae across vast distances, and Roman shipping moved it through every port on the Mediterranean. Wherever the legions went, vineyards followed, and many of Europe's most famous wine regions today, including Bordeaux, the Rhone Valley, and the Moselle, were first planted under Roman influence. The Romans drank wine constantly. Soldiers received daily rations of it. The wealthy drank aged versions, and almost everyone considered it safer than water in cities where wells were often suspect. Wine was food, medicine, currency, and ritual woven into the rhythm of ordinary days. And yet, empires do not last. As Rome's grip on Europe began to loosen, the vineyards it had planted faced an uncertain future, dependent on whoever might inherit the slopes after the legions had gone home. When Rome fell, much of Europe entered a long uncertainty. Roads decayed, trade routes shrank, and many of the great Roman vineyards were abandoned. The wine of antiquity, traded in amphorae across an empire, gave way to something quieter, made for the village, the household, and above all, the church. It was Christian monasteries, more than kings or merchants, that carried European winemaking through the medieval centuries. Wine was essential to the celebration of Mass, and monks needed a steady, reliable supply. As monastic orders spread across France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, they cleared forests, drained marshes, and planted vines on slopes no one else had bothered to tend. The monks had something most others lacked, which was time. A peasant family could not afford to wait decades to learn whether one hillside produced better wine than another, but a monastery, with its slow rhythms of prayer and labor, could keep records across generations. Nowhere was this more important than in Burgundy. The Cistercian and Benedictine monks who settled there began to study their land with extraordinary patience. They walked the slopes, tasted the soil, noted which vines flourished in which pockets of earth, and over centuries mapped the hillsides into a fine mosaic of small plots. The word for this idea, eventually became terroir, a French term with no perfect English translation. It suggests that wine carries the memory of where it grew, the soil's minerals, the angle of the slope, the way morning light falls, the drainage of rainwater. Two vineyards a few meters apart can produce wines that taste noticeably different, and the monks of Burgundy were among the first to take that seriously. They were so meticulous that some of the plots they identified nearly 1,000 years ago are still recognized as superior today. The map of the Côte d'Or, Burgundy's most famous strip of vineyards, owes much of its structure to monastic observation across long, quiet centuries. Elsewhere in Europe, similar work continued. In Champagne, monks tended vineyards that would later become famous for sparkling wine. Along the Rhine and Moselle, religious orders planted Riesling on steep slate slopes, while abbeys in Italy and Spain preserved local grapes that might otherwise have disappeared. Outside the monasteries, wine remained part of ordinary medieval life. It was poured at weddings, blessed at festivals, taxed by rulers, and used as medicine when little else seemed to help. The great Atlantic trade between Bordeaux and England flourished during these centuries, supplying English nobles with the light reds they called claret. Slowly, the foundation was being laid for the wine regions we know today. The slopes had been mapped, the grapes had been chosen, and the patterns of trade had begun to settle into the rhythms that would one day cross oceans. For most of human history, wine had been a Mediterranean and European story. The vine grew where the Romans had planted it, in a band of temperate hills running from Portugal to the Caucasus. But beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries, as European ships began to cross greater stretches of ocean, the vine began to travel farther than it ever had before. Spanish missionaries carried grapevines to the Americas, planting them in Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. They needed wine for Mass, and shipping it across the Atlantic was expensive and slow. Within decades, vineyards stretched across the highlands of what would become Latin America. In some places, the vines flourished beyond anyone's expectations. The dry, sunny climate of central Chile, protected by the Andes on one side and the Pacific on the other, turned out to be remarkably well suited to viticulture. Argentina's high-altitude plains, particularly around Mendoza, offered similar promise, and both countries would eventually become major wine producers. Farther south, Dutch settlers in the 17th century brought vines to the Cape of Good Hope, in what is now South Africa. The area around Stellenbosch and Constantia would become famous for its sweet dessert wines, exported even to the courts of Europe. In North America, the story was more complicated. European settlers in the eastern colonies found native grapevines growing wild, but their wines tasted strange and often unpleasant. The familiar Vitis vinifera that the colonists planted struggled to survive, falling victim to local pests and diseases. It was on the western coast that European vines finally took hold. Spanish missionaries moving north from Mexico planted vineyards along the California coast in the 1700s. By the mid-1800s, settlers and immigrants had begun planting in Sonoma and Napa, sensing that the climate there might rival anything in Europe. Australia received vines in the late 1700s, brought by the first European ships from South Africa and Europe. The country's earliest commercial vineyards took root in New South Wales and the Hunter Valley, then spread to South Australia, where regions like the Barossa Valley would eventually produce some of the world's most distinctive wines. New Zealand was a later arrival, with vines planted seriously only in the 1800s. In the 20th century, the cool maritime climate of regions like Marlborough would prove ideal for certain white grapes, producing wines that would surprise the world. In each of these places, wine had to learn the land all over again. The European grape varieties had spent centuries adjusting to their original soils and climates, and now they were being asked to begin again, sometimes thousands of miles from home. And in the meantime, back in Europe, a tiny insect was preparing to change everything. Before we follow that tiny insect into the vineyards of Europe, it helps to pause and consider the vine itself. Of all the grape species that grow on earth, only one is responsible for nearly every wine you have ever tasted. Its name is Vitis vinifera, the wine-bearing grape. There are dozens of other Vitis species scattered across the world. North America alone is home to several, including Vitis labrusca, the wild grape of the eastern forests, and Vitis riparia, the river grape that climbs along stream beds. These species produce fruit, but their flavors are usually too musky or unfamiliar for most palates. Vitis vinifera is different. It produces grapes with the right balance of sugar, acid, and aromatic compounds to make wines that age, develop, and reward attention. Within this single species lies somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 named cultivars, each one a slightly different version of the same plant. These cultivars are what wine drinkers call grape varieties: Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, Sangiovese, Tempranillo, and every other name on a wine label refers to a particular variety of Vitis vinifera. Each one has its own ripening pattern, its own preferred climate, its own flavor signature, its own quiet personality. What is remarkable is that nearly every one of these varieties is genetically identical to itself across the world. A Chardonnay vine planted in Burgundy and a Chardonnay vine planted in California share the same essential genetic code. They are, in a sense, clones, propagated not by seeds but by small cuttings grafted onto rootstock. This is why grape varieties remain so stable across centuries. The Pinot Noir of medieval Burgundy is essentially the same plant as the Pinot Noir of modern Oregon, even though the wines may taste quite different. The genetics travel. The place changes the expression. Yet, despite this genetic consistency, the vine is also quietly responsive. It picks up cues from soil, sun, water, and temperature. The same variety grown in a cool valley and a warm slope will ripen at different rates, develop different aromas, and produce wines that taste like cousins rather than twins. A vine is not a fast plant. It takes 3 to 4 years before a newly planted vine produces fruit worth using, and many growers believe a vine does not begin to make its most expressive wine until it is 10 or 15 years old. Some vineyards in Europe contain vines well over 100 years old, their gnarled trunks twisted by decades of pruning. The plant is small, patient, and faithful. It does not need rich soil and often prefers poor, stony ground that forces its roots to dig deep. Once it has settled into a place, it can keep returning year after year for longer than most human lives. To understand wine, then, is partly to understand the rhythm of this single plant and the long, slow year it walks through. The vine lives by the seasons more honestly than most of us do. Its year has a shape, roughly the same wherever Vitis vinifera grows, only mirrored between the northern and southern hemispheres. To follow that shape is to follow the rhythm that makes every bottle possible. Winter is the vine's time of quiet. The leaves have fallen, the sap has retreated into the trunk and roots, and the plant looks almost dead, though it is only resting. During these cold months, vineyard workers move through the rows with pruning shears, cutting away most of the previous year's growth. Pruning is one of the great quiet arts of viticulture. A vine left unpruned will grow wildly, producing too many bunches of grapes, none of which will ripen properly. Skilled pruners shape each vine carefully, deciding how many buds will be allowed to develop into shoots in the coming year. In early spring, as the soil warms, the vine awakens and sap begins to flow again. The first sign of life is a soft swelling at the tips of the canes, followed by tiny green points that emerge into the air. This moment is called bud break, and it carries a quiet anxiety, because a sudden late frost can damage the young shoots and reduce the year's harvest before it has truly begun. As spring deepens, the shoots grow rapidly. By late spring, small clusters of pale, almost invisible flowers appear along the new growth. Flowering is brief, lasting only a week or two, and rain, wind, or cold during this window can prevent proper pollination and reduce the eventual yield. If the flowering succeeds, tiny green berries begin to form. Summer is the season of slow growth as the grapes swell, the leaves spread, and the vine pours its energy into the developing fruit. Vineyard workers move through the rows, training the shoots along wires, trimming excess leaves, watching for disease. Then, in late summer, comes one of the most beautiful transformations in the vineyard year. The grapes begin to soften and change color, red varieties shifting from green to deep purple, white varieties taking on a golden, translucent glow. This stage is called veraison, and it marks the beginning of the grape's final ripening. From veraison onward, sugar accumulates inside the berries while acidity gradually drops. The growers walk the rows, tasting individual grapes and measuring sugar levels in small refractometers. The decision of when to harvest is one of the most important a winemaker will make all year, since too early gives thin and sour wine, and too late gives flabby and overripe wine. Harvest itself comes in late summer or autumn, depending on the climate and the variety. In some regions it is done by machine, in others entirely by hand. Either way, it is the culmination of nearly a year of patient watching. And then the vine begins to rest again, preparing quietly for another long, faithful return. If the vine has a year, the vineyard has a place. In wine, place matters more than almost anywhere else in agriculture. Two vineyards growing the same grape, by the same methods, in the same year, can produce wines so different that even casual drinkers can tell them apart. This is the quiet truth behind the word terroir. As the French use it, terroir gathers together everything about a vineyard's environment that shapes the wine. It includes the soil, the slope and direction of the hillside, the local climate, the patterns of rain and wind, even the microscopic communities of yeast that live on the grape skins. Soil is perhaps the most discussed element. Different soils drain differently, hold heat differently, and offer different minerals to the vine's roots. Limestone, common in Burgundy and Champagne, gives a particular flinty or saline quality to white wines, while volcanic soils, found in parts of Italy, Greece, and Hungary, can give wines a smoky, mineral edge. In Bordeaux, the differences are even more localized. The famous left bank of the Gironde estuary sits on deep gravel, which drains well and ripens Cabernet Sauvignon beautifully. The right bank, only a few miles away, sits on clay and limestone, which suits Merlot better, and this single geographical accident shaped two of the most distinct red wine traditions in the world. Climate, of course, plays a defining role as well. Cool climates produce grapes with higher acidity, lighter color, and more delicate aromas, while warm climates ripen grapes more fully, producing wines with a greater body, higher alcohol, and richer flavors. A single grape variety, planted in Germany and again in Australia, will taste as if it had different ancestors entirely. Even within a single region, microclimates matter. A south-facing slope in the northern hemisphere captures more sun than a north-facing one. A vineyard near a river may benefit from cooling mists in summer, while a hillside above a fog line might enjoy gentler ripening than the valley floor below. The slope itself shapes drainage, sun exposure, and root depth. Vines grown on steep slopes often struggle against the soil, forcing their roots downward in search of water. This struggle, paradoxically, tends to produce more concentrated, more interesting wines. There is also a human dimension to terroir, though traditionalists sometimes prefer to keep it separate. The grape varieties planted, the pruning techniques refined, the cellar practices passed down through generations, all become part of what a region tastes like. Place and people grow into each other over time. To say a wine has terroir is not a mystical claim. It is simply an observation that the place where a grape grew can be tasted in the glass, not always loudly, sometimes only as a whisper. But it is there. And once the grapes are picked, the next quiet transformation begins. In the mid-1800s, something began to go wrong in the vineyards of France. Vines that had thrived for generations started to weaken, their leaves yellowing, their growth slowing, and then halting. Within a few years, entire vineyards were dying, and no one could understand why. The cause, when finally identified, turned out to be almost too small to see. A tiny insect called Phylloxera vastatrix, no larger than a grain of sand, was feeding on the roots of European vines. It punctured the roots, drained their sap, and left the vines to die. The insect was native to North America, where local wild grape species had evolved alongside it and built up natural resistance. Vitis vinifera, the European grape, had no such defenses. When Phylloxera arrived in Europe in the 1860s, almost certainly hidden on imported plant material, it found vineyard after vineyard of helpless, defenseless vines. What followed was one of the worst agricultural disasters in European history. Over the next several decades, Phylloxera spread across France, then Italy, Spain, Germany, Portugal, and beyond. By some estimates, 2/3 of European vineyards were destroyed or had to be replanted, and many families abandoned land their ancestors had tended for centuries. For a time, no one knew what to do. Growers tried flooding their vineyards, injecting toxic chemicals into the soil, and replanting with hybrid grapes. Nothing worked well enough or tasted right enough to save the great traditions of European wine. The solution, when it came, was both ingenious and humble. If American vine roots were resistant to Phylloxera, then perhaps European vines could be grafted onto American roots. The top of the plant, the part that produced grapes, would remain Vitis vinifera, while the roots, the part the insect attacked, would be a sturdy American species. The idea was controversial. Some traditionalists believed grafting would change the flavor of the wine forever, that the soul of European viticulture would be lost. But the experiment worked, and slowly, painfully, the great vineyards of Europe were replanted, root by root, vine by vine. This is why, even today, nearly every grapevine grown for wine in the world rests on rootstock of American origin. The Pinot Noir of Burgundy, the Sangiovese of Tuscany, the Tempranillo of Rioja, all grow from European tops grafted onto American bottoms. The only exceptions are a few isolated regions where the insect never arrived, such as parts of Chile and certain sandy or volcanic soils. The Phylloxera crisis reshaped the wine world in ways that go beyond rootstock. Many minor grape varieties did not survive the replanting, and vineyards were rebuilt with the most reliable, most marketable varieties, narrowing the genetic diversity of European wine. Some traditions were lost entirely, and yet the vine endured, as it always has. Once the grapes have been picked, a transformation begins that is older than any winery, older than any written recipe, older than any tradition. It is the same transformation that probably gave humanity its first taste of wine all those thousands of years ago. It is called fermentation. At its heart, fermentation is a small miracle of chemistry. Yeast, a single-celled organism, consumes the sugar inside a grape and releases two things in return: alcohol and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide escapes as gentle bubbles, while the alcohol stays behind in the juice. The yeast that does this work has been present all along. It lives naturally on the skin of the grape, on the surface of leaves, on the wood of barrels, on the walls of old cellars. When the grapes are crushed and their juice is released, the yeast already there meets the sugar already there, and the conversation begins. For most of human history, this was how all wine was made, with wild yeasts on wild grapes doing their quiet work in clay vessels or wooden vats. Today, many winemakers still rely on these native yeasts, believing they carry the character of the place. Others prefer to add cultivated yeast strains, chosen for their reliability and for the flavors they tend to produce. The fermentation itself begins slowly. For the first day or two, very little seems to happen, but then the surface of the juice begins to bubble softly, then more vigorously, until the entire vat is alive with movement and sound. Cellars during harvest can feel almost as though they are breathing. The temperature of fermentation matters greatly. Too hot, and the yeast will produce harsh flavors or die before its work is done. Too cold, and the fermentation will stall. Most modern wineries control temperature carefully, using cooling jackets on stainless steel tanks or the natural coolness of old stone cellars. Primary fermentation usually takes 1 to 3 weeks, depending on the wine being made. The yeast consumes the sugar steadily, converting it into alcohol, until either the sugar runs out or the alcohol level becomes too high for the yeast to survive. At that point, the wild dance of fermentation grows quiet. Many red wines, and some whites, also undergo a second transformation called malolactic fermentation. This is not yeast at work, but bacteria which convert the sharper malic acid found in grapes into the softer lactic acid found in milk. The result is a rounder, creamier wine, less crisp, but often more complex. By the end of fermentation, the juice that began as sweet grape liquid has become something altogether different. It is now wine in its young and unfinished form. The alcohol is present, the structure is there, but the flavors are still raw, and the wine still has much to learn. What happens next depends on the kind of wine being made and the choices made by the people who tend it. Red wine begins with a quiet observation. The juice inside a grape, whether the grape is red or white, is almost always pale, and cutting open a Cabernet Sauvignon berry reveals clear, slightly yellow liquid. The color of red wine, then, must come from somewhere else, and that somewhere is the skin. This is the central truth of red winemaking. To produce red wine, the juice must spend time in contact with the skins, drawing out their color, their flavor, and the substances that give red wine its structure. This process is called maceration, and it shapes nearly every aspect of the wine that follows. After harvest, red grapes are typically destemmed and lightly crushed, breaking the skins to release the juice. The resulting mixture, called must, is poured into a fermentation vessel of stainless steel, concrete, oak, or in some traditions, clay. The skins, the juice, and any remaining pulp now sit together, beginning their slow exchange. As fermentation begins, something interesting happens. The carbon dioxide released by the yeast pushes the skins to the surface, where they form a thick floating layer called the cap. If left alone, the cap would dry out and stop contributing color and flavor to the wine below. Winemakers solve this in one of two traditional ways. They either press the cap back down into the juice by hand, a technique called punch down, or they pump juice from the bottom of the tank up and over the cap, called pump over. Both methods keep the skins wet and the extraction working steadily through fermentation. What the skins offer the wine is twofold. The first is color, which comes from compounds called anthocyanins, found in the skin's outer layers. The second is tannin, a family of compounds that gives red wine its grip, its structure, its capacity to age. Maceration typically lasts from a few days to several weeks, depending on the wine. Lighter reds like Pinot Noir or Beaujolais may have only brief skin contact, while heavier reds like Cabernet Sauvignon or Nebbiolo may stay on their skins for weeks, drawing out as much depth and tannin as possible. When the winemaker decides the extraction is complete, the wine is drawn off from the skins, a step called racking. The remaining solid material, now soaked through, is gently pressed to release the last of the liquid. This pressed wine is often blended back or sometimes set aside, depending on the style being made. The young red wine is then moved to vessels for aging. Many fine reds spend months or years in oak barrels, which soften the tannins, add subtle flavors of vanilla, spice, or cedar, and allow tiny amounts of oxygen to interact with the wine. Others rest in stainless steel or concrete, preserving brighter fruit. By the time the wine is bottled, the dark juice from the press has begun to find its shape. The grape skins, the yeast, and the patient hands of the winemaker have done their work. White wine takes a different path, beginning with a different choice. Where red winemaking depends on long contact with the skins, white winemaking aims to remove them quickly, before they can give too much color or weight to the wine. The goal is something lighter, brighter, more delicate. White wine can be made from white grapes, but it can also be made from red ones, since the juice of nearly every grape is pale. What matters is keeping that pale juice separate from the colored skins as soon as possible. This is the central difference between white and red winemaking. After harvest, white grapes are usually pressed almost immediately. Sometimes the grapes go straight into the press without being crushed first, a method called whole cluster pressing, which produces the gentlest juice. The skins, stems, and seeds are separated and discarded, leaving only the clear liquid behind. This juice is then allowed to settle, often in a cool tank, so that any solids drift to the bottom. The clearer juice is drawn off the top and moved to a fermentation vessel. This careful settling step helps produce a cleaner, more refined wine. Fermentation for white wine is usually slower and cooler than for red. Cooler temperatures preserve the delicate aromatic compounds that give white wines their distinctive perfumes: the citrus, the green apple, the white flowers, the stone fruit. A white wine fermented too warm loses these subtleties quickly, replaced by heavier, less refined flavors. Stainless steel is a common choice for fermenting white wine. The metal contributes no flavor of its own, allowing the pure character of the grape to come through. Some white wines, however, are fermented in oak barrels, which add a richer texture and notes of butter, vanilla, or toast, particularly common in classic Chardonnay styles. After fermentation, many white wines are aged on their lees, the spent yeast cells that settle to the bottom of the vessel. The winemaker may gently stir these lees back into the wine, a process called bâtonnage, which adds creaminess and a subtle savory quality, often described as a freshly baked bread aroma. The choice of malolactic fermentation also matters greatly for white wines. A Chardonnay that undergoes full malolactic fermentation becomes rounder and creamier, while one that does not retains a crisp, apple-bright character. The same grape, fermented in different ways, can produce wines that taste like entirely different drinks. When the wine is ready, it is often filtered and stabilized to ensure clarity in the bottle. Some winemakers, however, prefer minimal intervention, allowing the wine a slight haze in exchange for greater texture and character. The range of white wine is vast, from the crisp brightness of a Sauvignon Blanc to the deep golden richness of an aged Chardonnay. Each one tells a different story of how grape and winemaker chose to meet. Beyond red and white lie a family of other wines, each made by a slightly different method. Sparkling wines, rosés, and fortified wines all begin with the same basic transformation, but each takes a different turn afterward. Sparkling wine is, in essence, wine with carbon dioxide trapped inside it. The classic method, developed in the Champagne region of France, begins with a still base wine, often a blend of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. This wine is bottled with a small addition of sugar and fresh yeast, then sealed. Inside the sealed bottle, the new yeast begins a second fermentation. The carbon dioxide it releases dissolves into the wine, building pressure. After months or years, the bottle is opened just long enough to remove the spent yeast, then sealed again for the final time. This is called the traditional method, and it produces the finest sparkling wines in the world, including Champagne and Spanish Cava. There is also a faster method used for Prosecco and many simpler sparkling wines, in which the second fermentation happens in a large tank rather than in individual bottles. These wines are lighter, fruitier, and meant to be drunk young. Rosé is the gentlest cousin in this family. Its color comes from brief contact between red grape skins and their juice, just enough to draw out a pale pink hue, but not enough to extract heavy tannin. The skins may stay in contact for only a few hours, after which they are removed, and the wine continues like a white. Another method, called saignée, involves bleeding off a portion of juice from a red wine fermentation early on. This concentrates the remaining red wine and produces a pink wine as a kind of byproduct. The result is often deeper in color and richer in flavor than rosés made by direct skin contact. Fortified wines take a different path altogether. They are wines to which a neutral grape spirit has been added during or after fermentation. The added alcohol raises the wine's strength to roughly 20%, well above ordinary table wine, which gives these wines their long-keeping power. The timing of fortification determines the wine's character. If the spirit is added partway through fermentation, the yeast dies before consuming all the sugar, leaving a sweeter wine. This is how port is made in the steep vineyards of Portugal's Douro Valley, producing a wine rich, sweet, and dark. If the wine is fully fermented before fortification, the result is drier, as in sherry from southern Spain. Sherry develops further through unique aging practices, sometimes under a protective layer of yeast called flor, sometimes through deliberate exposure to oxygen. Madeira, from the Atlantic island of the same name, is heated during aging, giving it an unusual and remarkable resilience. Each of these styles began as a practical solution to a problem, and each has become a tradition of its own. Every wine, no matter how complex, can be understood through four basic elements working together. They are present in every glass ever poured, whether the wine is a delicate Riesling or a powerful Cabernet. To understand them is to understand what your mouth is actually doing when you taste wine. The first pillar is acid. Acid gives wine its brightness, its sense of life, the sharp edge that makes the mouth water, the way fresh lemon juice keeps food from feeling heavy and dull. Cool climate wines tend to have more acid, since grapes preserve more of it when they ripen slowly. Acidity is also what allows wine to age. A wine with low acid loses its structure quickly, while one with bright acid can develop and improve for decades. This is one reason great German Rieslings can survive a century or more in the bottle, kept alive by their crisp electric edge. The second pillar is tannin, the compound that gives red wine its grip. Tannin comes from grape skins, seeds, and stems, and also from oak barrels. And you feel it more than you taste it, a slight drying sensation across the gums and tongue, similar to the feeling of strong black tea. Tannin gives wine its architecture, the bones beneath its flavor. Young red wines often taste firm or even astringent because of their tannins. With time, those tannins soften, bind together into longer chains, and lose their sharpness. A well-aged red wine has tannins that feel like fine sand, present but no longer aggressive. The third pillar is sugar, though most table wines are technically dry. During fermentation, nearly all the natural grape sugar is converted into alcohol. Yet small amounts of sugar may remain, and even a tiny quantity can shift a wine's perceived character, rounding off the edges and softening the acid. Sweet wines, made by stopping fermentation before all the sugar is consumed, occupy their own territory. They range from off-dry whites to rich dessert wines like Sauterne, where botrytis-affected grapes concentrate sugars to remarkable levels. Sweetness is not a flaw, only a deliberate choice. The fourth pillar is alcohol, which contributes more than just intoxication. Alcohol gives wine its body, its sense of weight and warmth on the palate. A wine with low alcohol feels light and refreshing, while one with high alcohol feels rich, even slightly hot in the throat. These four pillars exist in constant conversation. A wine with high alcohol needs sufficient acid and tannin to balance it, while a wine with crisp acid needs some body to keep it from feeling thin. The art of winemaking and the art of grape growing before it is the long, patient effort of bringing these elements into harmony. When a wine feels right, it is because these four are in proportion. Nothing dominates, nothing is missing. If structure is what wine feels like in the mouth, then aroma is what wine smells like in the glass. And it is often where the deepest pleasure lives. The human nose can distinguish thousands of distinct scents, and a complex wine may carry hundreds of them, layered like notes in a slow piece of music. These aromas arise from compounds so small and volatile that they evaporate into the air the moment a wine is poured. Some come directly from the grape itself, others from fermentation, and still others from the slow chemistry of aging. Each layer tells part of the wine's story. The first layer is called primary aromas, and they come from the grape. These are the fruit, flower, and herb scents that announce a wine's variety. A Sauvignon Blanc may smell of cut grass and gooseberry, a Riesling of green apple and lime, a Cabernet Sauvignon of black currant and cedar, a Pinot Noir of cherry and rose petal. Different grapes produce different primary aromas because they contain different aromatic compounds. Some, like Muscat or Gewürztraminer, are intensely perfumed even in the vineyard, the air around the vines fragrant during harvest. Others reveal their character only after fermentation, when their aromas are coaxed into the air. The second layer is called secondary aromas, and they come from fermentation. These are subtler scents introduced by yeast, by bacteria during malolactic fermentation, and by extended contact with the lees. Notes of bread dough, yogurt, butter, or biscuit often belong to this layer, particularly in white wines aged on their lees. The third layer is called tertiary aromas, and they appear with time. As a wine ages, its primary fruit aromas slowly fade and are replaced by something quieter, more complex, more savory. Aged reds may take on leather, dried herbs, tobacco, forest floor, or truffle, while aged whites may develop honey, almond, beeswax, or toasted nuts. Oak adds its own family of aromas. New oak barrels contribute vanilla, baking spice, smoke, coconut, or toast, depending on the wood and how heavily it was charred. Older barrels add less aroma, but still allow the wine to breathe gently through their pores, helping flavors integrate. This is part of why wine experts swirl their glasses before smelling. The motion releases more of the volatile compounds into the air above the wine, where the nose can catch them. Temperature matters as well, since wines too cold release fewer aromas, while wines too warm may smell overwhelming or alcoholic. Smelling wine is one of its quietest pleasures. Even before the first sip, the glass tells you something about the season the grapes saw, the cellar where the wine rested, the hands that tended it. The nose, in a sense, reaches back through every stage of the wine's life. And in the slow chemistry of time, those aromas continue to change. Most wine is meant to be drunk young. Despite the popular image of dusty bottles and candlelit cellars, the great majority of wines made each year are produced for early enjoyment, tasting their best within a year or two of release. After that, their fresh fruit and bright acidity begin to fade. Only a small portion of the world's wine is built to age. These are usually wines with strong structure, substantial tannin and acid, and enough complexity to remain interesting as their character slowly changes. A truly age-worthy wine does not simply survive time, it is improved by it. What happens chemically during aging is subtle and slow. Tannins, which begin in young wine as small molecules, gradually link together into longer chains that feel softer on the palate. Eventually they grow heavy enough to fall out of the wine as sediment, which is why old red wines deposit a fine residue at the bottom of the bottle. Color shifts as well. Young red wines tend to be deep purple, sometimes nearly black, and as they age, they fade to garnet, then brick, then sometimes the soft brown of an old library. White wines move in the opposite direction, deepening from pale gold to amber as they grow older. Aromas change, too. The bright primary fruit of youth gives way to the savory, layered tertiary notes that connoisseurs prize. A young Bordeaux may smell of black currant and cedar, while a 30-year-old bottle may smell of leather, tobacco, and damp forest floor. Aging happens in two different ways. Some wines age in barrel, where small amounts of oxygen seep through the wood and accelerate certain reactions, while others age in bottle, where almost no oxygen reaches the wine. Most fine wines experience both. Storage matters greatly. Wine prefers a cool, steady temperature, around 12 to 15 degrees Celsius, with reasonable humidity to keep the cork from drying out. It also prefers darkness and stillness, since heat, light, vibration, and temperature swings can all damage a wine over time. Not every wine will improve forever. Each has a window when it is at its best, a kind of plateau, after which it begins to decline. The window varies enormously, from a few years for most wines to several decades for the finest Bordeaux, Burgundy, Barolo, or German Riesling. Knowing when to open a bottle is one of wine's enduring uncertainties. Open it too young, and the wine may be tight and unyielding. Open it too late, and the fruit may have faded entirely. The middle moment, when structure and complexity are in balance, is sometimes called a wine's peak, though few wines announce that moment clearly. Decanting can help reveal a wine's character, especially with older bottles where sediment must be left behind. Pouring slowly through a clean vessel separates wine from sediment and gives it a moment to breathe. And so the wine waits quietly until the right moment comes. Of all the grapes used to make wine, a small number have come to dominate the world's vineyards. These are the so-called noble varieties, grapes that travel well, ripen consistently, and produce wines that age and improve. Among the most famous are two reds from Bordeaux, often growing side by side and often blended together, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. Cabernet Sauvignon is the more famous of the two, partly because of its strength of character. Genetic studies have shown that the grape emerged in the 17th century in Bordeaux as a natural cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. The result was a small, dark, thick-skinned berry with remarkable structure. The wines made from Cabernet Sauvignon share a recognizable signature. They are deeply colored, firmly tannic, with aromas of blackcurrant, cedar, graphite, and sometimes mint or bell pepper. Their flavors carry well through long aging, and a great Cabernet at 30 years old can still feel composed and dignified. Merlot, by contrast, is the softer, rounder sibling. Its berries are larger, its skins thinner, its tannins gentler. It ripens earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon and tends to produce wines that are approachable younger, with plummy fruit, dark chocolate, and a velvety smoothness. For centuries, these two grapes have shared the vineyards of Bordeaux. On the left bank of the Gironde estuary, where deep gravel soils favor Cabernet, the great wines are built around Cabernet Sauvignon, with Merlot added to soften it. On the right bank, where clay soils hold water better, Merlot takes the lead. This blending is one of the secrets of Bordeaux. Cabernet provides structure, longevity, and depth, while Merlot provides flesh, warmth, and accessibility. Together, they often produce wines that neither could make alone, balancing power with grace and structure with softness. When these grapes left Europe, they traveled remarkably well. Cabernet Sauvignon in particular found new homes in Napa Valley, in Tuscany, alongside the Super Tuscan movement, in Coonawarra in Australia, and in the warm valleys of Chile. In each place, it adapts to local conditions while keeping its essential character. Merlot, too, found wide success, particularly in California, Washington State, and northern Italy. It remains the most widely planted grape in Bordeaux itself, producing wines from the everyday to the legendary, including some of the most expensive bottles ever sold. Together, Cabernet and Merlot account for an enormous share of the world's fine red wine production. They are versatile, adaptable, and consistently rewarding, a kind of common language understood by drinkers across continents. And yet, alongside them, another red grape walks a quieter, more difficult path. It is rarer, more fragile, and more demanding, but in the right hands it produces some of the most beautiful wines in the world. Pinot Noir is sometimes called the heartbreak grape. It is fragile, fickle, and difficult to grow well, with thin skins that make it vulnerable to rot, sunburn, and rain at the wrong moment. It buds early, ripens unpredictably, and produces less fruit than most grapes, so even successful harvests are smaller. And yet, when it succeeds, Pinot Noir produces some of the most haunting wines in the world. Where Cabernet impresses with power and structure, Pinot Noir whispers. Its color is paler than most reds, sometimes barely deeper than a dark rosé, and its aromas are perfumed rather than weighty. The grape's spiritual home is Burgundy in eastern France, where it has been cultivated for at least 1,000 years. The Cistercian and Benedictine monks who mapped the slopes of the Côte d'Or were observing Pinot Noir more than any other grape in their long study of terroir. The wines of Burgundy, divided into hundreds of small vineyards, are nearly all made from this variety. What makes Burgundy so remarkable is that the same grape, grown on vineyards sometimes only a few meters apart, can produce wines of startlingly different character. One slope yields elegance and finesse, while the neighboring slope, of slightly different soil and exposure, yields a wine of more depth and weight. No grape responds more sensitively to place. The classic aromas of Pinot Noir include cherry, raspberry, rose petal, and dried herbs, with deeper notes of mushroom, forest floor, and damp earth that develop with age. A great old Burgundy can smell almost meditative, layered with complexity that unfolds slowly in the glass. Pinot Noir was long considered impossible to grow well outside Burgundy. For decades, attempts elsewhere produced wines that were either too heavy or too thin, missing the delicate magic of the original. Over the past several decades, that has changed. In Oregon's Willamette Valley, with its cool climate and volcanic soils, Pinot Noir found a second home. The wines made there are different from Burgundy, perhaps fruitier and less austere, but unmistakably of high quality. Oregon has become one of the most respected Pinot Noir regions in the world. New Zealand, particularly the regions of Marlborough and central Otago, has also produced remarkable Pinot Noirs. The cool maritime climate suits the grape well, and the wines often combine bright fruit with the structure to age. Germany, too, in regions like Baden and the Ahr Valley, makes elegant Pinot Noir, known there as Spätburgunder. In California, the cool coastal areas of Sonoma, the Russian River Valley, and Anderson Valley have all become respected sources, particularly where ocean fog moderates the warmth. Even in Australia and Chile, growers continue to search for the right corner of land where this difficult grape might flourish. Pinot Noir rewards patience and humility. It cannot be forced, only coaxed. Beyond Cabernet, Merlot, and Pinot Noir lie a handful of other red grapes that have shaped entire wine traditions of their own. Each one carries the character of a particular place, yet each has also traveled, finding new homes far from where it began. Their stories are as much about migration as about flavor. Syrah is the great red of France's northern Rhone Valley, where it produces wines of extraordinary depth and complexity. In its homeland, on the steep granite slopes around Hermitage and Côte-Rôtie, Syrah yields dark, brooding wines with aromas of black pepper, smoked meat, violets, and blackberry. These are wines built for slow contemplation, often aged for decades. The same grape, planted in Australia, becomes a different creature. There it is called Shiraz, and the wines made from it, particularly in the Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale, are richer, riper, leaning toward chocolate, blackberry jam, and warm spice. The grape is the same, but the climate has changed its language entirely. Sangiovese is the soul of central Italy. It is the principal grape of Tuscany, the foundation of Chianti, Brunello di Montalcino, and Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. Sangiovese produces wines that are bright with acidity, savory rather than sweet, often tasting of sour cherry, dried herbs, leather, and tomato leaf. Sangiovese has not traveled as successfully as some of its peers, perhaps because it depends so closely on the dry, sun-warmed hillsides of Italy. Where it does succeed, it produces wines deeply suited to Italian food, designed to be drunk slowly across long meals, threaded through conversation and bread. Tempranillo is Spain's noble grape, particularly in Rioja and Ribera del Duero. It produces medium-bodied red wines with aromas of red cherry, dried fig, vanilla, and tobacco, often shaped by extended aging in American oak. The Spanish tradition of aging wine for many years before release means Tempranillo is often already mature when it reaches the market. In Argentina, an unexpected grape became a national symbol. Malbec, originally a minor variety in Bordeaux, and the more important grape of Cahors in southwest France, found extraordinary success in the high-altitude vineyards of Mendoza. Beneath the Andes, Malbec produces deep purple wines of plum, violet, and dark chocolate. These grapes, along with Cabernet, Merlot, and Pinot Noir, account for most of the world's serious red wine. Yet there are countless others worth knowing, including the spicy Grenache of southern France and Spain, the structured Nebbiolo of Piedmont, the savory Carmenere of Chile, the elegant Cabernet Franc of the Loire. The world of red wine is wider than any single drinker can ever fully explore. Each region quietly insists on its own traditions, its own grapes, its own way of meeting the year. And alongside all of these reds, an equally vast family of whites has its own story to tell. Of all the white grapes in the world, Chardonnay is perhaps the most familiar. It is planted on every wine-producing continent, drunk by more people than any other dry white wine, and used in countless styles, from crisp and steely to round and buttery. Behind that familiarity is one of the most quietly remarkable grapes in winemaking. Chardonnay began, like Pinot Noir, in Burgundy, The two grapes share much of their ancestry, and they often grow on neighboring slopes. Genetic studies have shown that Chardonnay emerged as a natural cross between Pinot Noir and an old grape called Gouais Blanc, a humble variety once grown across medieval France. What makes Chardonnay extraordinary is its receptiveness. The grape has only a moderate aroma profile of its own, so it takes on the character of where it grows and how it is made. A Chardonnay from cool Chablis tastes of green apple, lemon, and whetstone, while a Chardonnay from warm California can taste of pineapple, ripe pear, and honeysuckle. This adaptability has made Chardonnay a winemaker's grape. The choices made in the cellar shape its final character as much as the vineyard does. Fermenting in stainless steel produces a lean, bright wine, while fermenting in oak barrels adds richness, texture, and notes of vanilla, butter, or toast. In Burgundy, Chardonnay reaches its most refined expression. The great white wines of Meursault, Puligny-Montrachet, and Chassagne-Montrachet are made entirely from this grape, aged carefully in oak, and capable of evolving for decades. Chablis, in the cool northernmost part of Burgundy, makes a different style, sharper, more austere, often unoaked. Champagne, too, relies heavily on Chardonnay. The grape is one of three principal varieties used in classic champagne blends, and certain wines, labeled Blanc de Blancs, are made entirely from Chardonnay. These are typically the most delicate and elegant style, with crisp acidity and fine bubbles. Outside Europe, Chardonnay has thrived almost everywhere. Napa Valley and Sonoma in California produce rich, oaked Chardonnays that help define the modern style. Australia and New Zealand make both lean and broader styles, while South Africa, Chile, and Argentina have all developed distinctive expressions. For a time, in the late 20th century, Chardonnay became almost too popular. Many producers made oaky, buttery wines that overwhelmed the grape's subtlety. A backlash followed, sometimes called the ABC movement, standing for anything but Chardonnay, and many drinkers turned away. But Chardonnay has quietly recovered. Today, the best examples balance fruit, oak, and acidity with restraint, and the grape is once again admired for its complexity and range. A great Chardonnay can rival nearly any white wine in the world, and alongside it, several other white grapes carry their own kind of magic, often more aromatic, more openly perfumed. If Chardonnay is the chameleon of white wine, other grapes wear their identity more openly. The aromatic whites announce themselves before the first sip, filling the room with perfume from the moment the bottle is opened. Two stand out for their distinctive personalities, Sauvignon Blanc and Riesling. Sauvignon Blanc is a grape of bright, herbaceous character. Its aromas often suggest cut grass, green pepper, gooseberry, lime, passion fruit, and sometimes a faint hint of fresh cat. The exact bouquet depends on where it grows, but its sharpness, its sense of freshness, is almost always present. The grape's classical home is the Loire Valley in central France, particularly in the appellations of Sancerre and Puy-les-Fumes. There, On chalky and flinty soils, Sauvignon Blanc produces wines of stony elegance, lean and bright, with notes of citrus and a smoky mineral edge, sometimes called gunflint. In Bordeaux, Sauvignon Blanc plays a different role, blended with Semillon, to make both crisp, dry whites and the great sweet wines of Sauternes, where grapes affected by noble rot concentrate their sugars to extraordinary levels. These are some of the longest-lived white wines in the world. But the modern story of Sauvignon Blanc belongs largely to New Zealand. Beginning in the late 20th century, growers in Marlborough discovered that their cool maritime climate produced an intensely aromatic style, with tropical fruit and crisp acidity. Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc became a global phenomenon within a generation. Riesling is a different creature entirely. Where Sauvignon Blanc shouts, Riesling sings, a high, clear note of grape and place. It thrives in cool climates, particularly Germany, Alsace in France, Austria, and the Clare and Eden valleys of Australia, with its homeland on the steep slate slopes of Germany's Mosel and Rhine. Riesling can be made dry or sweet or anywhere in between. Its aromas often include lime, green apple, white peach, honey, and jasmine, sometimes with a striking note that aged Riesling develops, often described as petrol or kerosene. This sounds strange, but in a great old Riesling, it is a sign of complexity rather than fault. What makes Riesling remarkable is its capacity to age. A great German Riesling from a top vineyard can develop for 50 years or more, slowly trading its youthful fruit for layers of honey, beeswax, and minerality. Its high acid and aromatic intensity protect it through the decades. Beyond Sauvignon Blanc and Riesling lie other aromatic whites worth knowing. Gewürztraminer from Alsace and northern Italy smells of lychee, rose, and ginger, while Viognier from the northern Rhone offers apricot, honeysuckle, and white flowers. Albarino from northwestern Spain suggests peach, sea salt, and citrus. Each of these grapes carries the perfume of a particular place. To pour a glass is to release that place into the room. Of all the wine regions in the world, Bordeaux may be the most famous. Its reputation has been built over centuries through legendary estates, careful classification, long Atlantic trade routes, and wines that have shaped how the world thinks about red wine. To understand Bordeaux is to understand much of fine wine. The region sits in southwestern France, where the Garonne and Dordogne rivers meet and become the broader Gironde estuary. This watery geography is central to Bordeaux's character, moderating the climate, providing transport, and dividing the region into two distinct halves. Each half has developed its own grapes, its own soils, and its own traditions. The left bank of the Gironde, including the Médoc, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, and Saint-Estèphe, sits on deep gravel soils washed down from the Pyrenees over many ages. These soils drain well and ripen Cabernet Sauvignon beautifully. Left bank wines are built around Cabernet, supported by Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and small amounts of Petit Verdot. The right bank including Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, sits on cooler, heavier clay soils that hold water and stay cool. Here, Merlot takes the lead, often supported by Cabernet Franc. The wines tend to be softer, plummier, and more approachable in youth, though the very best can age for many decades. Bordeaux is organized around the idea of the chateau. The word literally means castle, but in wine it refers to an estate that grows its own grapes and makes its own wine, with its own buildings, vineyards, and identity. Some chateaux are enormous, others modest farms, but each carries a name and a story. In 1855, on the occasion of a great exposition in Paris, the wines of Bordeaux were ranked into a formal classification. The leading estates of the Medoc were divided into 5 tiers, called crus, with the top tier known as Premier Cru, or first growth. This classification has remained influential to this day. The 5 first growths are Chateau Lafite Rothschild, Chateau Latour, Chateau Margaux, Chateau Aubryon, and Chateau Mouton Rothschild, this last added in 1973. Their wines, when made well, are among the most celebrated in the world, sometimes aging gracefully for over a century. But Bordeaux is far more than its top estates. Tens of thousands of producers make wine across the region, from grand chateaux to small family farms. Many produce excellent wine at modest prices, and the region remains one of the great sources of everyday claret. Bordeaux's wines tend to share certain qualities. They are usually blends rather than single variety wines, designed to balance the strengths of multiple grapes. They are built for aging, firm and tannic in youth, but evolving toward complexity and elegance over decades. And just east of Bordeaux, in another corner of France, lies a region of equal fame but very different philosophy. If Bordeaux is the wine region of the chateau, then Burgundy is the wine region of the vineyard. Where Bordeaux builds its reputation around great estates that own many hectares, Burgundy builds its reputation around individual parcels, sometimes as small as a single acre, each with its own name and character. This difference shapes everything. Burgundy lies in eastern France in a thin strip of vineyards stretching south from Dijon. The most famous portion is the Côte d'Or, the slope of gold, where the vineyards run along a long, gentle escarpment, facing east and southeast, catching the morning sun. Almost all red Burgundy is made from Pinot Noir, and almost all white Burgundy from Chardonnay. The variety is fixed. What varies is the place. A wine from one named vineyard may taste profoundly different from a wine made by the same grape in the same year, only a few hundred meters away. The monks who first mapped these slopes over many centuries identified differences in soil, drainage, and exposure that produced wines of distinct character. Their observations have been preserved in a complex hierarchy of appellations, the system by which French wines are named. Burgundy's hierarchy is one of the most detailed in the world. At the broadest level are regional appellations, simply labeled Bourgogne, made from grapes grown anywhere in the region. Above them are village appellations, named after villages like Pommard, Volnay, or Meursault. And above those are premier cru vineyards, considered superior plots within a village. At the very top are Grand Cru vineyards, the small handful of named sites with the longest, most distinguished histories. The Grand Cru list includes legendary names. Romanée-Conti, perhaps the most famous vineyard in the world, covers less than 2 hectares and produces wines that fetch extraordinary prices at auction. Chambertin's, Latache, Musigny, and Le Montrachet each carry centuries of reputation. Burgundy's small scale has been shaped by inheritance laws. Following the French Revolution, vineyard land was divided among heirs across generations, fragmenting plots into ever smaller parcels. Today, a single Grand Cru vineyard may be divided among dozens of owners, each with a different style. This means that, unlike in Bordeaux, the name of the vineyard alone is not enough. The producer matters greatly, since 2 winemakers tending neighboring rows in the same vineyard may make very different wines. Learning Burgundy is partly learning which producers tend which plots. The wines themselves can be transcendent. Great red Burgundy combines power with elegance, fruit with savoriness, fragrance with structure. Great white Burgundy can age for decades, developing layers of honey, almond, and gentle minerality. To drink Burgundy carefully is to drink a place, and through that place, the patient work of generations who knew it before. North of Burgundy lies one of the most famous wine regions in the world, though its wines are not still but sparkling. Champagne sits on chalky hills about 150 kilometers northeast of Paris, near the cool northern limit of French viticulture. The climate is challenging, the soils thin, the wines distinctive. Champagne's chalk soils were once an ancient seabed made of compressed shells of tiny sea creatures. These soils drain remarkably well and reflect light onto the vines, helping the grapes ripen in a climate that would otherwise be too cool. They also provide the cool, stable cellars in which champagne ages, sometimes carved as tunnels deep into the chalk. 3 grapes dominate the region. Chardonnay produces delicate, elegant wines, often labeled Blanc de Blanc, while Pinot Noir contributes structure, body, and the capacity to age. Pinot Meunier, the 3rd grape, brings a rounder, fruitier quality, especially useful in everyday champagne blends. The traditional method, called méthode champenoise, was largely developed in this region. Wines undergo a second fermentation inside the sealed bottle, trapping carbon dioxide and creating the fine bubbles for which champagne is famous. The process is slow, requiring months or years of aging on the spent yeast cells. Champagne is organized around great houses, many of which have become global names. Veuve Clicquot, Krug, Paul Roger, and Bollinger trace their histories back to the 17 and 1800s. Each house has its own style and its own approach to maintaining consistency from year to year through careful blending. Most champagne is non-vintage, a blend of wines from multiple years designed to express a house style. In exceptional years, a producer may declare a vintage champagne, made entirely from grapes harvested in a single year. These wines are typically richer, more complex, and built to age. Just south of Champagne stretches one of France's longest and most varied wine regions, the Loire Valley. The Loire River flows over 1,000 kilometers from the central mountains to the Atlantic, and vineyards line much of its course. No single grape dominates here, since each section of the river has its own traditions. In the upper Loire, around Sancerre and Pouilly-Fume, Sauvignon Blanc produces wines of stony elegance. Further west, around Vouvray and Saumur, the great grape is Chenin Blanc, capable of producing dry, off-dry, sweet, and sparkling wines of remarkable longevity. In the western Loire, around Anjou and Muscadet, other styles emerge. Muscadet, made from Melon de Bourgogne, is a crisp, sea-fresh white traditionally paired with oysters from the Atlantic coast. Anjou produces both rose wines and full-bodied Chenin Blancs of distinctive character. Together, Champagne and the Loire show how varied northern French wine can be, even within a relatively small stretch of land. Italy is a country shaped by wine. Every one of its 20 regions produces wine, from the snowy slopes of the Alps in the north to the volcanic islands off the southern coast. No other country has as many native grape varieties or as many wines that taste unmistakably of where they came from. Two regions in particular have shaped Italy's international reputation, Tuscany and Piedmont. They lie in central and northwestern Italy and produce wines of very different character, though both rely on grapes deeply rooted in their local soils. Tuscany is the land of Sangiovese. The grape is the foundation of Chianti, made in the rolling hills between Florence and Siena, and of Brunello di Montalcino, made further south around the medieval town of Montalcino. Vino Nobile di Montepulciano completes the trio, each distinctive, but all sharing Sangiovese's bright acidity and savory, food-friendly character. For a long time, Tuscan wine was bound by tradition, including strict rules about which grapes could be used in which appellations. In the 1970s and 80s, a group of producers began making wines outside these rules, often blending Sangiovese with Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot. These wines, called Super Tuscans, broke the old categories and won international acclaim. Piedmont, in northwestern Italy, sits beneath the Alps and produces wines of an entirely different character. Its great red grape is Nebbiolo, a difficult variety that produces wines of pale color but ferocious tannin and astonishing aromatic complexity. Nebbiolo can smell of roses, tar, dried cherries, leather, and truffles all at once. Two appellations define Piedmont's reputation, Barolo and Barbaresco. Both are made entirely from Nebbiolo. Both come from neighboring hills in the Langhe, and both produce wines that require years of aging before they reveal their full character. A great old Barolo is among the most haunting wines in the world. Piedmont also produces lighter reds from grapes like Barbera and Dolcetto, and a remarkable white called Gavi, made from Cortese. The region is varied, but Nebbiolo remains its truest signature. Veneto, in the northeast, contributes some of Italy's most popular wines. Prosecco, the light sparkling wine made from the Glera grape, comes from the hills north of Venice. Valpolicella, a medium-bodied red, and its powerful sibling Amarone, made from grapes dried until they concentrate, are also Veneto productions. Sicily, the great island off Italy's southern coast, has emerged in recent decades as one of the country's most exciting wine regions. The volcanic slopes of Mount Etna produce wines of remarkable minerality, while Nero d'Avola, the island's traditional red, makes wines of deep fruit and warmth. And these are only the most famous corners. Every Italian region carries its own grapes, its own ancient methods, its own way of meeting the year. South of France lies the Iberian Peninsula, where two countries share a long, sun-warmed history of winemaking. Spain has more land under vine than any other country, though it produces somewhat less wine than France or Italy. Portugal, despite its smaller size, has preserved one of the most diverse collections of native grape varieties anywhere. Spain's most famous wine region is Rioja, where Tempranillo produces medium-bodied reds traditionally aged for years in American oak barrels. The wines develop notes of red cherry, vanilla, dried herbs, and leather, often arriving at the market already mature and ready to drink. Further west lies Ribera del Duero, where Tempranillo takes on a deeper, more powerful character. The high-altitude vineyards along the Duero produce wines of greater concentration, with darker fruit and firmer tannins. The rocky slopes of Priorat produce intense, mineral-laden reds from old Grenache and Carignan vines. Spain also makes one of the world's most distinctive aromatic whites, Albarino, from the cool Rias Baixas region in the northwest. In Andalusia, the fortified wines of Jerez, known in English as sherry, have been produced for centuries under hot Atlantic skies. Portugal's most famous wine is port, the fortified sweet red from the steep, terraced vineyards of the Douro Valley. The same valley produces excellent dry reds from native grapes like Touriga Nacional. Further north, the rainy region of Vinho Verde produces light, slightly sparkling whites meant to be drunk young. The New World has been producing distinctive wines of its own for longer than many realize. Napa Valley in Northern California emerged in the late 20th century as one of the world's most respected Cabernet Sauvignon regions, with wines that can rival Bordeaux. Sonoma, just to the west, makes a wider range of styles, including superb Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. In Argentina, the high-altitude vineyards of Mendoza, beneath the Andes, have made Malbec into South America's signature wine. The thin air, intense sun, and cool nights produce wines of deep color, dark fruit, and softness. Chile, on the other side of the mountains, produces Cabernet Sauvignon and the savory Carmenère of similar quality. Australia's wine country is famously diverse. The Barossa Valley produces some of the world's most powerful and beloved Shiraz, while Coonawarra makes structured Cabernet Sauvignon on its distinctive red Terra Rosa soil. The Hunter Valley produces a style of Semillon that ages remarkably well. New Zealand has built its reputation on Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, but its cool climate Pinot Noir from central Otago and Martinborough has also drawn acclaim. South Africa makes excellent Chenin Blanc, Pinotage, and Cabernet from the Cape region near Stellenbosch. The world of wine, once concentrated in Europe, is now woven through every continent that grows vines. A wine label is the bottle's introduction, the brief story it tells before being opened. To someone unfamiliar with wine, labels can feel like a foreign language full of unfamiliar place names, antique scripts, and confusing classifications. Once a few patterns are understood, the label becomes a quiet guide to what lies inside. The world of wine labels divides broadly into two traditions. Old World labels, from countries like France, Italy, Spain, and Germany, tend to emphasize the place where the wine was made. New World labels, from places like the United States, Australia, Argentina, and South Africa, tend to emphasize the grape variety. A bottle labeled Chablis tells you it comes from the Chablis region of Burgundy, and the wine inside will be Chardonnay. A bottle labeled Pommard tells you it comes from the village of Pommard, and the wine inside will be Pinot Noir. The grape is implied by the place, but the place is what appears on the label. In contrast, a bottle from California labeled Chardonnay tells you exactly what grape is inside, but may not specify a precise region. New World labels often combine grape variety with a broader region, like Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon or Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Beyond grape and place, most labels show the vintage, the year the grapes were harvested. Vintage matters because each year's weather shapes the wine in distinctive ways. A great vintage in Bordeaux may produce wines of legendary depth, while a difficult vintage yields lighter, more variable wines. The producer name is usually prominent on the label. In Burgundy and elsewhere, the producer name may matter more than the vineyard name, since different producers tend the same plots in different ways. Recognizing trusted producers is one of the quiet pleasures of becoming familiar with wine. Labels often include an appellation, a regulated designation of origin. In France, these include the letters AOC for Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, in Italy, DOC or DOCG, in the United States, AVA, for American Viticultural Area. These systems verify that the wine comes from where it claims and that it follows certain rules of grape variety and production method. The alcohol percentage is usually listed somewhere on the label, often in small text. Most table wines fall between 11 and 15% alcohol, with cooler climates producing lower alcohol wines and warmer ones higher. This number gives a useful hint about the wine's likely body and weight. Some labels mention specific aging terms like Reserva or Gran Reserva in Spain, indicating extended aging before release. Others note techniques like estate bottled, meaning the producer grew the grapes and made the wine on the same property. A label, once you can read it, is less of a riddle and more of a map. It can quietly tell you what to expect, what the wine might pair with, and how long to keep it. Wine and food have lived together for as long as both have existed. In nearly every wine-producing region, the local food and the local wine have grown up alongside one another, slowly learning to fit. A meal of Tuscan ribollita and Chianti, of Burgundian beef stew and Pinot Noir, of Spanish Jamin and Rioja, was not invented by anyone but evolved. For most of history, pairing was simply a matter of what was at hand. People drank the wines their valley produced with the foods their land grew. The harmonies that emerged were practical rather than theoretical, but they were often profound, and they remain the quiet foundation of most modern pairing wisdom. The old rules are familiar: red wine with red meat, white wine with fish, and these guidelines hold often enough to be useful. But they are blunt instruments, and a delicate Pinot Noir suits salmon better than a heavy-oaked Chardonnay does, while a rich Sauterne pairs beautifully with foie gras or blue cheese. A more useful principle is matching weight. A light, delicate dish calls for a light, delicate wine, while a rich, heavy dish calls for a richer, fuller wine. A green salad wants a crisp Sauvignon Blanc, not a powerful Cabernet, while a slow-braised lamb shoulder wants a generous Syrah or Tempranillo. Tannin and protein have a particular friendship. The tannins in red wine bind to proteins in meat, softening the wine's grip and revealing its fruit beneath. This is why a tannic young Cabernet, which can feel astringent on its own, becomes harmonious with a grilled steak. And the pairing is not just tradition, but chemistry. Acid plays a similar role. A wine with bright acidity can cut through rich, creamy, or fatty dishes, refreshing the palate between bites. Champagne with fried food, Sancerre with goat cheese, Riesling with pork belly, dry rose with grilled vegetables. These pairings work because the wine's acid balances the food's richness. Sweetness deserves attention too. Sweet wines pair beautifully with spicy foods, since the sugar tames the heat, and with salty foods, as in the classic combination of port and Stilton cheese. They also pair with sweet foods, though here the wine must be at least as sweet as the dessert, or it will taste thin and sour by comparison. The most thoughtful pairings often work by contrast as well as harmony. A salty cheese with a honeyed wine, a fatty fish with a bright acidic white, a spice dish with a slightly sweet wine. These contrasts can be more memorable than perfect matches because the two flavors lift each other into something new. In the end, pairing is less of a science than a quiet, slow game. There are guidelines worth knowing, but rules worth breaking. The most important pairing is the one you enjoy, with the people you enjoy it alongside. Tasting wine, in the careful sense, is not the same as drinking it. Anyone can drink wine, while tasting it is a way of slowing down, paying attention, and letting the wine reveal itself one layer at a time. It involves nearly all of the senses, working quietly together in a span of less than a minute. The first sense engaged is sight. Hold a glass up to a light or tip it slightly against a white surface, since the color tells a quiet story. Red wines range from pale ruby to deep purple to garnet to brick, depending on the grape and the age, while white wines move from clear pale gold to deeper honey or amber. Cloudiness or sediment may indicate that the wine has not been filtered or that it is old enough to throw deposits. Neither a fault, but only a sign. A slow tilt of the glass also reveals viscosity, sometimes called legs, as the wine slides down the inside surface. Higher alcohol and higher sugar both produce slower, more visible legs. Next comes the swirl. A gentle rotation of the glass causes the wine to coat the inside surface, releasing volatile aromatic compounds into the air just above. This is the moment to bring the glass to your nose and breathe in slowly, with the lips slightly parted. Smell is where wine reveals most of itself. The nose can distinguish thousands of distinct scents, and a complex wine may contain dozens at once. Look for fruit aromas first, the most prominent layer, then for secondary notes of bread, butter, or yogurt, and tertiary notes of leather, earth, mushroom, or honey. If the wine has aged, now take a small sip. Let the wine move across the front of the tongue, the sides, and the back, each region picking up different sensations. The front detects sweetness, the sides detect acid, the back detects tannin and bitterness, while the whole palate detects texture and body. Note the four pillars at work. How much acid is there, that mouth-watering sharpness? How much tannin, that drying grip? How much alcohol, that warmth on the throat? And how much sweetness, if any? A well-balanced wine has all four in proportion, with none dominating the others. Then there is the finish, the lingering taste after the wine has been swallowed or spit out. A long finish, where flavors continue to evolve for many seconds, is usually a mark of quality. A short finish, where the wine disappears quickly, often signals a simpler wine. You do not need to identify every note to taste well. The point is not to perform expertise, but to notice, to slow down, to let the wine show you what it has to show. Tasting is, at its quietest, a form of attention given to something a vine spent a year preparing. And once you have noticed, you can drink the rest of the glass with the same attention, or simply let it become a friend present in the room. And so, the long story can grow quiet now. We began with a grape and a forgotten vessel in a cool corner of the world, with wild yeast meeting sugar in a clay pot somewhere in the Caucasus, 8,000 years ago. We have followed the vine since, across continents and centuries, through monasteries and mountains, through wars and harvests and patient slopes facing the sun. None of it was inevitable, yet all of it has happened, and all of it is still happening tonight. We have watched wine become the companion of pharaohs, of philosophers, of medieval monks marking out the hillsides of Burgundy with care that would last 1,000 years. We have crossed oceans into the New World, where the vine had to learn the land all over again, and slowly succeeded. We have walked beneath the Andes, beside the Pacific, and along the steep terraces of the Douro. We have looked closely at the vine itself, this small, patient plant that does not ask for rich soil, only for sunlight and a slope. We have followed its year through pruning and bud break, through flowering, veraison, and harvest. We have watched fermentation transform sugar into something altogether new, a transformation that happens somewhere in the world almost every day. We have considered the quiet chemistry of taste, the four pillars of acid, tannin, sugar, and alcohol in their constant conversation. We have smelled fruit and earth and old leather in glasses of wine that had been waiting decades for the right moment. We have learned that aging is patience made into flavor, and that some of the best things in the world cannot be hurried. We have visited Bordeaux's chateau and Burgundy's vineyards, Champagne's chalk cellars, and the Loire's winding river. We have walked through Tuscany's hills, Piedmont's mists, Spain's sun-warmed slopes, and Portugal's terraced valleys. We have seen how each place leaves its mark on what is poured into the glass, and we have ended with the simplest things: a label, a pairing, a careful tasting. The quiet way that wine and food and people have always come together in rooms small and large across thousands of years of evenings, much like this one. What lingers, after all of this, is not facts or names or vintages. It is a sense that wine is a kind of time made drinkable, the time of a vine, of a season, of a region, of a cellar, of a generation. To open a bottle is to release some of that time into a single evening, into a single room, into a single quiet moment. The world outside your window keeps turning. Somewhere a vine is reaching toward the sun. Somewhere else grapes are slowly ripening on a hillside under a moon you cannot see, and a cellar is cool and still, and a wine is quietly becoming what it will be. The world slows, and so do we. Good night.